My name is Vanessa Hale. At 33, I had designed data systems that processed over 400 million transactions a day across 9 states. My brother called me the family failure. He said it at his own wedding, in front of 200 guests, standing next to his bride's multimillionaire father. My parents backed him up. My mother added her favorite line, the one she had been polishing for years. And the man my brother was so desperate to impress looked at me, went completely still, and said 5 words that cracked the entire evening wide open. What happened after that, what it cost my brother, what it cost my parents, what it finally gave me permission to stop carrying, none of them saw coming. I barely did either, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Welcome to her side of the story, for every woman who held it together, alone. If you've ever been the one nobody bragged about, this story is for you. Drop a comment, and make sure you're subscribed, because you are going to want to see exactly how this one turns. Let me take you back to where it actually started. 6 weeks before the wedding, on a Tuesday night in March. I was sitting in my apartment in Charlotte, eating leftover soup, when my phone buzzed with a notification from a group chat I had been removed from 3 weeks earlier. The Hole family chat. They had added me back, not to catch up, not to apologize. The message from my brother, Trent, read, "Are you coming or not? Don't make it weird." I hadn't been in that chat since early February. My mother created it 4 years ago, back when Trent launched his startup, and suddenly needed a built-in audience for every milestone photo, every press mention, every round of applause he could manufacture from people who happened to share his last name. The chat had 312 unread messages when I was removed. I only noticed because the notification badge disappeared. Nobody told me. Nobody had to. I scrolled through Trent's message. Below it, my mother had typed, "Vanessa, please just confirm." Brielle's family is very particular about headcounts. Brielle Sterling, Trent's fiancée, daughter of Walter Sterling, the venture capital investor whose fund had reportedly backed over a dozen companies in the last 3 years, nearly all of them in data infrastructure. I knew the name because everyone in my industry did. Sterling Capital was one of the firm's licensing infrastructure built on systems I had helped architect at Northgate Systems. I didn't think about that connection then. I was too busy reading the next message, this one from my father. Donald Hale, a man who communicated almost exclusively through silence, had typed a single line, "It would mean a lot, Mayor." That was the most my father had said to me in a text message in 2 years. I put the phone down, picked up my soup. The broth had gone cold. Here is what you need to understand about my family. We had one success story, and it was never me. It was Trent who had dropped out of a business program to launch a data intelligence startup that had raised $11 million, and landed on 3 different companies to watch lists before his 30th birthday. And me, I was the daughter who built things nobody in my family could see. The last time I went home for dinner was in January. My mother had invited the neighbors, the Whitfields, nice people, retired, the kind who asked polite questions and actually waited for the answer. Mrs. Whitfield asked what I did for work. Before I could open my mouth, my mother waved her hand like she was swatting a fly. "Oh, Vanessa does computer things. Databases or something." She turned to Mrs. Whitfield with a smile that looked rehearsed in front of a bathroom mirror. "We don't really brag about her," she said it lightly. "The way you'd mention you don't keep dessert in the house. A simple fact of life. A household policy." Mrs. Whitfield looked uncomfortable. My father studied his pot roast. Trent, who had driven up from Raleigh that weekend in a Lease sedan, leaned back in his chair and grinned. The rest of the dinner was about my mother recited his accomplishments the way a museum docent walks you through an exhibit. The angel round, the partnerships, the office space. She left out the part where my parents had pulled $140,000 from their retirement savings to cover his Series A shortfall. I knew about it because my father had mentioned it once, in a phone call so quiet I thought the line had dropped. "We believe in him, Mer," he'd said. "Your mother and I, we put in what we had. $140,000. 31 years of a middle school administrator's pension contributions and a dental hygienist's overtime pay. Converted into equity in a company my brother ran and my mother narrated. I didn't argue. I never did. That was my problem, not that I trusted them, but that I had stopped expecting anything from them a long time ago. At Northgate Systems, I was a senior data systems architect. I'd been there 6 years. The system I built, we called it Meridian, was a real-time data orchestration engine, handling pipeline routing for enterprise clients across financial services, logistics, and healthcare. If you've ever swiped a debit card at a grocery store in the southeastern United States, there's a reasonable chance my architecture touched that transaction. Nobody at Northgate called me a failure. My colleague Jenna used to joke that I was the ghost who built the spine of the place. I designed the bones. Other people got to walk around inside the body. That spring, Northgate CTO forwarded me an invitation to speak at a regional infrastructure summit in Atlanta. My name was listed alongside 2 patents I'd co-authored in a keynote panel on scalable pipeline architecture. I almost declined. I usually did. Not because I couldn't speak in public. I'd done it a dozen times. But because I had grown so used to being invisible, that visibility felt like standing in the wrong lane of traffic. Professional isolation. That's what my therapist called it. She said I had organized my entire life around being competent and unseen, and that both of those things were costing me something I hadn't fully calculated yet. I told her I'd think about it. Then I went back to my desk and optimized a failover protocol that saved Northgate's biggest client 6 hours of downtime during a system migration. Nobody sent me flowers. Nobody posted about it anywhere. But when I pulled up the diagnostics the next morning and saw 0 failed transactions across 9 routing nodes, I felt the quiet satisfaction that only people who build things for a living understand. That was enough. Or I had decided it was. 2 weeks after the group chat reappeared, I drove to my parents' house. I told myself it was to drop off a set of replacement air filters my father had asked for. That part was true. Mostly, I went because something in my father's 6-word text had pulled at the part of me that still wanted to believe the word family meant something in that house. The living room hadn't changed. Same floral couch, same brass lamp, and on the mantel above the fireplace, a new addition, a glass trophy engraved Rising Founder, Triad Business Journal. It sat between a framed photo of Trent shaking hands with an investor and a candle. My mother had never lit no photos of me on that mantel, not one. Trent was in the kitchen eating a sandwich my mother had cut diagonally for him. He was 30 years old. He looked up, grinned, and said it like a punchline he'd been saving. Every family needs one success and one cautionary tale. Right, Mare? My mother laughed. My father looked at his hands. I set the air filters on the counter. Before I left, Trent caught me at the door. The grin was gone. He leaned in, voice low. You're coming to the wedding. I need you there. I asked why. He shrugged, but his eyes didn't match the shrug. Brielle's dad is old school. Wants to see the whole family. Just show up. Be normal. Don't talk about work. Don't talk about work. The one thing that was entirely mine, and my brother's instruction, was to leave it at the door like muddy shoes. 4 years earlier, Trent had called me at 11 at night. He was 26, 3 months into Lumora and panicking. He'd pitched investors on a proprietary real-time data engine, except he didn't have one. What he had was a pitch deck, a leased office, and a demo running on a spreadsheet macro. I just need the core module, he said. Something that works for the demo. I'll hire a real team once the round closes. He was my brother. My mother had called twice that week to tell me Trent was under pressure. My father had sent a rare text. He could use your help, Mare. So I helped. I spent 3 weeks building a functional prototype, a stripped-down data routing engine inspired by the design principles I used at Northgate, but written from scratch on my own laptop, on weekends and after midnight. Entirely outside my employment agreement. My own methodology. My own naming conventions. My own logic patterns. Clean, documented, modular code. Because that's the only kind I know how to write. We signed a consulting agreement. Trent promised a $10,000 fee and a co-architect credit on the technical documentation. He paid me $1,500. The credit never appeared. What did appear, 14 months later, was Lumora's public product page describing their proprietary engine, a system I recognize the way you recognize your own handwriting. Same architecture, same module structure, same variable names in the API documentation. Trent had built Lumora on the bones I gave him. He renamed the modules, changed the dashboard color scheme, and called it innovation. I said nothing. My mother would have called me jealous. My father would have gone quiet, and Trent would have looked at me with that grin and said something about how family helps family. So I closed the tab, filed the consulting agreement in a blue folder, and went back to building things that worked. The blue folder lived in the bottom drawer of my desk at home, beneath a stack of old tax returns and a router manual for a router I no longer owned. A standard manila folder I'd reinforced with blue packing tape 3 years earlier because the original flap had torn. Inside, a printed copy of the consulting agreement, both our signatures, dated 4 years back. A printout of the original commit log 47 commits over 21 days, every one authored by V. Hale, a 3-page architecture specification in my own handwriting. Margin notes, a coffee ring near the bottom of page 2, and a single printed email from Trent, sent at 2 in the morning. Subject line, "Can you just make the demo work? I'll handle the rest." That email was the last honest thing my brother ever wrote to me about Loom. I didn't keep the folder as evidence. I didn't keep it to build a case. I kept it because I keep records of my own work. Always have. Every system I've ever designed, every spec I've ever written, I archive it. The same instinct that makes me back up my files in 3 places and label my cables. Some people keep journals. I keep documentation. That Tuesday in March, after reading Trent's message and sitting with the cold soup in the quiet apartment, I opened the bottom drawer, saw the blue folder, ran my thumb across the tape, closed the drawer again. Whatever Trent was building, or pretending to build, whatever my parents had poured their savings into, it wasn't my problem anymore. I had made my peace with being invisible, or I thought I had. Jenna told me not to go. We were eating lunch in the Northgate break room, turkey wraps. The ones from the place on Trade Street that puts too much mustard on everything. I told her about the wedding. She set down her wrap and looked at me the way she did when a junior engineer was about to push bad code to production. "Why would you go? They treat you like furniture." I couldn't argue with that. But something had shifted since January. Maybe it was the therapy. Maybe it was the summit invitation still sitting unanswered in my inbox. Maybe it was the plain arithmetic of turning 33 and realizing I had spent a decade making myself smaller so the people around me wouldn't have to feel short. "I'm not going to perform small so everyone else feels tall," I told her. Jenna raised her eyebrows. "That's a bumper sticker." "It's also true." I called my mother that afternoon and confirmed I'd attend. She sounded relieved, not for me, for the head count. Good Briel's family is very organized. Don't bring anyone. Don't wear anything and maybe don't mention Northgate. Trent gets sensitive when people compare. As if my career and his existed on the same axis. As if building real infrastructure and building a pitch deck were 2 versions of the same sport. I hung up and sat at my desk for a long time, staring at the blinking cursor on a config file I'd been editing. I almost didn't go. If you've ever talked yourself into shrinking just to keep the peace, you already know that feeling in your chest. Stay with me, because the moment I walked into that ballroom, everything I had swallowed for years finally had somewhere to land. Subscribe now so you don't miss how it turned. 3 weeks before the wedding, Lumora was everywhere. Trent landed a feature in a regional tech publication. The Quiet Disruptor. How one founder built a data engine that could change the game. I read it on my phone during a code review. The article described Lumora's proprietary real-time data intelligence engine as a paradigm shift in pipeline orchestration. The technical description quoted from Trent was almost word for word from the architecture spec I'd written 4 years earlier. Not the spirit of it. The actual sentences. The article also mentioned that Lumora was in advanced discussions with Sterling Capital for a significant Series A round. Walter Sterling's fund, the same fund whose portfolio companies already used Northgate's Meridian infrastructure. My system. The irony wasn't lost on me. It just didn't feel like irony yet. It felt like watching someone wear your coat in a photograph. and tell everyone they bought it in Milan. My mother posted the article in the family chat with a row of champagne emojis and the words "our boy." 12 relatives reacted with hearts and thumbs up. I didn't react. I didn't have to. Nobody noticed either way. That same week, Trent appeared on a local podcast. I listened to 43 minutes of my brother describing technology he didn't build, solving problems he didn't understand, using terminology he had learned from a spec I wrote in my apartment while eating reheated pasta at 2 in the morning. He sounded confident. He sounded credible. He sounded like someone who had practiced his lines so many times he had started to believe them. And the worst part, the part that made my hands tighten around my coffee mug, was that his engine was real. I had made it real. I just wasn't part of the story anymore. My mother called on a Thursday evening. I was reviewing a load balancing configuration for Northgate's Q2 migration. She didn't ask what I was doing. She never did. "Vanessa, I need to talk to you about the wedding." That particular tightness in her voice. The one reserved for conversations where she needed me to cooperate without asking questions. "Brielle's family is important. Walter Sterling is. He's not like us. He's the kind of man who pays attention. So when you're there, I need you to be supportive." I told her I'd be polite. I don't mean polite. I mean don't talk about technical things. Don't bring up Northgate. Don't say anything that makes Trent feel like you're competing. A pause. For once, just let your brother have his moment. For once. As if I had ever tried to take one. I wanted to ask her when, exactly, she thought I had ever competed with Trent for anything. I wanted to ask why she had pulled $140,000 from retirement to fund a company she couldn't describe accurately in a single sentence. I wanted to ask what it cost her every time she waved her hand and said she didn't brag about me. But I already knew the answer. My mother grew up in a family where nobody made it. Her father drove a delivery truck. Her mother cleaned offices. Nobody went to college. Nobody built anything. Carol Hale had spent her whole life terrified of being ordinary. She had chosen Trent as her proof that she wasn't. If she admitted I was the one who built something real, she would have to admit she'd been investing in the wrong person for 30 years. That was a debt she couldn't afford to acknowledge. So she covered it with the only currency she had, my silence. 10 days before the wedding, the chat lit up again. Not logistics this time. Trent, typing fast, asking if I could take a quick look at some technical documentation before a meeting. He didn't say what meeting. He didn't say with whom. It's just a review, like an hour max. Family favor. I recognized the pattern. Same cadence as 4 years ago. Same, just a quick thing that had turned into 3 weeks of building his company's spine. I scrolled up through the chat history I'd missed. Venue photos. Seating charts I wasn't consulted on. And buried between a caterer's menu link and Brielle's note about floral arrangements, a message from Trent to my mother: "Don't worry. She won't understand what's happening anyway. She just builds back-end stuff." The code running his entire company was back-end stuff. I typed a reply. "Send me the documents." He sent a 6-page technical summary of Lumora's infrastructure. The same summary, I assumed, that was headed to Sterling Capital. I read it in 14 minutes. He'd gotten the architecture overview mostly right, because he was describing my work. But the scalability projections were fabricated. The throughput numbers inflated by a factor of 3. And the section labeled proprietary innovation described a load distribution algorithm I had published in a Northgate white paper 2 years earlier. Trent hadn't just borrowed my code. He'd built an entire narrative around it. A narrative where he was the genius and the engine was his invention. And now he needed me to proofread the lie before handing it to his fiancée's father. I closed the document. I did not reply. The connection I should have made earlier arrived on a Monday morning during a routine stand-up at Northgate. Our VP of Client Relations mentioned that Sterling Capital had recently renewed their enterprise license for Meridian. "They're one of our longest infrastructure clients," she said. Walter Sterling apparently reviewed the architecture documentation himself when they first signed. Told our sales team it was some of the cleanest system design he'd seen in 20 years. She looked at me. "That was your work, Vanessa." I nodded. Took a sip of coffee. Didn't say anything. but a small, cold wire connected to points in my head that I'd been keeping carefully separate. Walter Sterling knew Meridian. Walter Sterling was about to invest in Lumora's engine was Meridian's younger sibling. Same bones. Same logic. Same handwriting. If Sterling's team ran any kind of serious technical due diligence on they would find code patterns, naming conventions, and structural choices that matched Meridian's architecture at a foundational level. And if they traced the authorship of those modules, they would find the name VHEL, my name. I sat with that knowledge the way you sit with a headache you're not ready to medicate, aware of it, uncomfortable, choosing not to act. It wasn't my job to police my brother's company. It wasn't my responsibility to call his investors and tell them the engine they were evaluating had been built by someone never credited, never paid in full, never mentioned in any of Lumora's filings. The truth was sitting in my bottom drawer inside a blue folder, waiting for nobody. If it mattered, it would surface through the right channels. If it didn't, I would go on building things that worked, and letting other people take credit. I had done it before. 2 weeks before the wedding, the pressure shifted from passive to active. Trent texted me directly, not the group chat, not through our mother at 9 at night. Be there by 4. Sit where they tell you. Don't be late and don't overdress. Brielle's family notices everything. I read it twice. My brother was managing me like a variable in a system he didn't understand. I almost laughed. Then my father called. The second time he'd called me voluntarily in over a year. His voice was careful, the way it got when he was trying to say something important without actually saying it. Vanessa, your mother and we've got a lot riding on this. The wedding, the business, all of it. A pause. I just need this to work out for him. We put everything in everything. He meant the $140,000. He meant the retirement account that now depended on Trent's startup being worth what Trent said it was worth. He meant the bet he and my mother had placed on their golden child. A bet they couldn't unwind without admitting they'd been wrong for a decade. I felt something I hadn't expected. Not anger, not resentment. A dull, heavy sadness, like holding a box too full to close. My parents were scared. They were 60 and 62 years old, and they had traded their security for a company built on borrowed architecture and inflated numbers. They didn't know that. They couldn't know that, because the only person who understood what Lumora actually was, what it was built on, where its code came from, was the daughter they didn't brag about. The message arrived on a Wednesday morning. LinkedIn, a connection request, followed by a note from someone named Marcus Bell, senior technical analyst at Sterling Capital. The note was professional, neutral, specific. Ms. Hale, our firm is conducting a technical assessment of a portfolio candidate in the data infrastructure space. During our code review, we identified architectural patterns and module structures that closely align with published documentation attributed to your work on Meridian at Northgate Systems. We would appreciate the opportunity to discuss provenance and authorship of certain foundational components. This is a standard part of our due diligence process. Could you make yourself available for a brief call this week? I read it 3 times. My heart rate stayed steady. Years of reading diagnostics under pressure had given me that. But my hands moved before my thoughts caught up. I opened the bottom drawer, pulled out the blue folder, laid it flat, opened it for the first time in over a year. The consulting agreement, Trent's signature, slanted and hurried. Mine, neat. The commit log, 47 entries, every one authored by V. Hale. The architecture spec, my handwriting in the margins, the coffee ring still dark on page 2, and Trent's email. Can you just make the demo work? Everything was there. It had always been there. The folder wasn't a weapon. It was a record. The same kind of record I kept for every system I'd ever built. The difference was that this particular record now sat at the exact intersection of my brother's ambition and his investor's due diligence. I hadn't put it there. The truth had walked itself into the room. I closed the folder. I did not reply to Marcus Bell that day. I spent 2 days thinking about that message. Not because the answer was complicated. It wasn't. Yes, I wrote the code. Here are the records. The hard part was the math around it. If I confirmed authorship to Sterling's analyst, The due diligence report would flag Lumora's IP provenance as unresolved. An unresolved IP flag in a Series A round isn't a speed bump. It's a wall. The investment would stall, maybe collapse. My brother's company, the one my parents had staked their retirement on, the one my mother recited like scripture, the one my brother had built his entire identity around, would face the kind of scrutiny that fake it till you make it doesn't survive. And everyone would blame me. My mother would say I did it out of jealousy. My father would go silent in that way that felt worse than shouting. Trent would tell anyone who'd listen that his sister sabotaged him because she couldn't handle his success. I sat at my desk for a long time, looking at the cursor on my screen. Then I opened a text editor and typed a sentence I never sent to anyone. It was just for me. I will not lie about my own work. That was the whole of it. I wasn't going to call Sterling Capital and volunteer confession. I wasn't going to march into Trent's office with a blue folder demanding credit. But if someone from the investors team asked me a direct question about code I had written, I was going to tell the truth. Not for Trent, not for my mother, not for a family that had spent a decade pretending I didn't exist. I replied to Marcus Bell, told him I was available Thursday. The rehearsal dinner was held at a vineyard 40 minutes outside Charlotte. White tablecloths, string lights. Brielle had hired a calligrapher for the place cards. I found mine at a table near the kitchen door, wedged between a second cousin I'd met once, and a college friend of Brielle's, who spent the evening on her phone. Trent and Brielle sat at the head table with Walter and Brielle's mother, Renata. My parents sat one table over, close enough to orbit, far enough to earn. When introductions went around the room, Trent stood and worked the crowd with the ease of someone who had practiced charm the way I practiced code review. Repetition, iteration, polish. He introduced his parents with warmth. He introduced Brielle's family with reverence. When he got to me, he paused. And this is my sister, Vanessa. She works with computers. A polite ripple of smiles. One man at a corner table, gray hair, wire-rimmed glasses. Name tag I couldn't read from my seat, tilted his head slightly when he heard my name. Not a reaction, exactly. More like recognition catching on a snag. The dinner moved on. Toasts were given. Trent told a story about how Lumora almost didn't launch, but he coded through the night and made it happen. I ate my salmon. I did not correct him. After dinner, as guests drifted toward the parking lot, the man with the wire-rimmed glasses passed my table. He stopped. Vanessa Hale, I nodded. I think I saw your name on a pipeline architecture panel in Atlanta. Scalable orchestration. I nodded again. He smiled small, knowing, and walked away. I never got his name. But someone in that room had recognized mine, for a reason that had nothing to do with Trent. On the drive home, I put the pieces together. Not all at once. More like tiles clicking into a mosaic I'd been assembling without realizing I was building anything. Trent hadn't invited me because he wanted me there. He'd invited me because he needed Walter Sterling to see a complete family. A normal family. A family that showed up, smiled, and didn't say anything inconvenient. But more than that, he needed me to be small. Visibly, publicly, undeniably small. Because if Vanessa Hale ever came up in conversation with Walter Sterling's technical team, Trent needed the room's memory of me to be a quiet woman at a back table who worked with computers. A nobody. A family footnote. A cautionary tale. If I was already labeled, if everyone had already seen me dismissed and diminished and introduced as an afterthought, then anything I said later about Lumora's code would sound like bitterness. Like jealousy. Like a failure trying to drag down a success. That was the strategy. Maybe not even conscious. Trent wasn't a planner, but he had the instincts of someone who had survived by controlling the narrative. And the narrative required me in the room, wearing my assigned role like a name tag. What my brother didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Walter Sterling's team had already been in my inbox. The due diligence was already running. And the architect whose name was flagged in their technical review wasn't an anonymous contractor or a disgruntled ex-employee. She was sitting at table 9, eating salmon, being introduced as the family failure. The collision was coming. I hadn't arranged it. I hadn't planned it. I had simply stopped being willing to lie about what I'd built. And the truth, as it tends to do, was finding its own way to the surface. The wedding was held at the Sterling Estate, 22 acres of rolling lawn, a stone manor house, a reception hall with marble floors and ceilings high enough to make you feel mini. A string quartet played near the entrance. Champagne flutes stood at attention on silver trays. Everything about the setting announced money that had been around long enough to stop announcing itself. I arrived at 4, wearing a navy dress I'd bought 2 years earlier for a conference I'd ended up skipping. Simple lines, no jewelry, except a watch my grandmother had given me. My mother would have preferred I faded further into the background. I chose the dress because it was mine, and I liked it, and I was done dressing for her comfort. The ceremony was brief and beautiful. Brielle looked luminous. Trent looked like a man who had rehearsed his tears. My parents sat in the second row, my mother in a lavender suit bought for the occasion, my father in a tie that didn't quite match his shirt. They looked proud. They looked invested, in every sense of the word. I sat 4 rows back, between strangers, watching my brother promise to love and cherish a woman, whose father ran the fund about to evaluate whether his company was real. Picture it. Marble floors, a string quartet, and me, the one they told to keep quiet. I almost turned around at the door. If part of you has ever stood at the edge of a room wondering if you belong, stay with me. What the bride's father said next changed which side of that room I stood on. Drop truth in the comments if you're rooting for her already. The reception began at 6. Tables arranged in concentric arcs around the dance floor. My seat was at the outer ring, table 11, near a side exit and a potted fern. Trent had assigned my placement personally. You're at 11. Great table. You can see the whole room. He said it with a smile when he found me holding a glass of water near the bar. I could also be seen by nobody. He took my elbow, lightly, performatively, and walked me through the crowd. This was his show. I was a prop. This is my sister. She's in it. To Brielle's aunt. Vanessa, she's the quiet one. To a groomsman. Family's bookworm. Never leaves her desk. To a couple I didn't recognize. Each introduction, a small, precise cut. Friendly enough to pass for humor. Sharp enough to draw blood. My parents trailed behind us. My mother smiled and nodded. My father looked at his shoes. When Brielle's mother asked what I did, my mother jumped in before I could answer. She's in tech support, I think. Something like that. I let it land. I let all of it land. But when Trent squeezed my arm and leaned in to whisper, "See, nobody cares, Mer. Just relax," I pulled my arm free. Not dramatically. Just enough that he felt the absence. "You can introduce me," I said quietly. "You don't get to script me," he blinked. Then the grin came back, the one that had been protecting him from accountability since childhood. "Relax, sis. It's a party." He walked away. I stayed where I was, standing full height, drinking water, waiting. Walter Sterling entered the reception at 6:30. He'd been taking photos with the wedding party, and his arrival shifted the energy in the room the way a current shifts the surface of a lake. Subtle, total. He was taller than I expected, gray at the temples. Wore his suit like it owed him nothing. His handshake, when he greeted people, was brief and direct. He didn't smile reflexively. He read the room before the room read him. Brielle kissed his cheek and brought him to a table where my parents were already seated. Champagne in hand, performing their best version of a family with nothing to hide. Trent was magnetic in that moment. Standing taller, speaking louder, telling a story about a partnership I happened to know was still in the letter of intent stage. Walter listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't nod along. He watched Trent the way an engineer watches a system under load, looking for where the strain would show. I wasn't supposed to be nearby. My table was across the room, but the bar stood between them and me, and I was still holding my glass of water when Trent spotted me. His eyes lit up, not with affection, but with utility. "Walter, come here. You haven't met my sister yet." He said it to Walter, but it was aimed at me. He reached out and pulled me toward the circle, the way you'd pull a suitcase off a carousel. Functional, graceless, purposeful. Walter turned. My mother straightened in her chair. My father set down his champagne glass, and Trent, grinning so wide his molars caught the overhead light, positioned me in front of the man whose fund was about to make or break his entire company. One hand on my shoulder, the other holding a champagne flute, he turned to Walter with the grin, half charm, half armor, and said it clearly enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "This is our family failure," he laughed. The kind of laugh designed to give other people permission to laugh too. A few guests obliged. My mother, seated 3 feet away, tipped her glass slightly and added her signature line, the one she had tested at dinner tables and church functions and neighborhood barbecues until it had the smooth delivery of a campaign slogan. "We don't brag about her," she said to Renata, who smiled politely. She said it the way she always said it, as a kindness, as modesty, as a mother who simply had one child worth discussing and one she kept in the margins. My father looked at his plate. Trent squeezed my shoulder. I stood still. I didn't flinch. I didn't smile. I didn't perform the role I'd been assigned, the good-natured sister who absorbs the joke, who plays along, who makes the golden child shine brighter by standing in his shadow. I stood with my back straight, my hands at my sides, my face absolutely neutral. 33 years of being the punchline, and I was finished laughing on cue. Walter Sterling had not spoken. He had watched Trent deliver the line. He had watched my mother add hers. And now he turned, slowly, the way someone turns when they're recalculating everything they thought they knew about the room they're standing in, and looked directly at me. Not at Trent, not at my parents, at me. His expression changed. Not dramatically. No gasp, no double take. His brow drew together. His lips pressed thin. He went completely still. The string quartet had paused between movements, and his voice carried further than he probably intended, or maybe exactly as far as he intended. "So, it's you. This is unexpected." 2 sentences. That's all it took to tilt the room. Trent's grin froze. My mother set down her champagne glass. Renata looked at her husband with an expression that said she'd seen this particular stillness before, and knew what it preceded. "I'm sorry," Trent said, still smiling, but the smile had detached from the rest of his face. "Do you two know each other?" Walter didn't look at Trent. He was still looking at me. "Miss Hale," he said. Not a question. A confirmation? Meridian? Northgate Systems? I nodded. "Yes. Your architecture runs in 11 of my portfolio companies." 12, I said. Verity Health migrated to Meridian in January. Walter's jaw tightened. Not with anger, something closer to the expression of a man who has just realized the math he's been running has a variable he missed. "Marcus's report flagged the provenance issue last week," he said, almost to himself. "I assumed the V-Hall in the authorship records was a former contractor. Or a coincidence." He looked at Trent, then back at me. "You're his sister." "Yes. And you built the foundational modules that Lumora's engine is based on." I didn't hesitate. I didn't dress it up, qualify it, or add caveats to protect anyone's feelings. I wrote the original architecture. The consulting agreement is dated 4 years ago. The commit history is mine. The room had gone very quiet. Not silent, there was still the clink of glasses somewhere, the murmur of guests who hadn't noticed. But the circle around us, Trent, my parents, Renata, Walter, and me, had become its own atmosphere. Trent moved first. He stepped between me and Walter, his body language shifting from charming host to a cornered animal in the space of a breath. "Okay, hold on. Hold on. She's exaggerating. She helped with an early prototype. That's it. Everything Lumora is today. The engine, the product, the platform, that's my team. My vision." She wrote a few lines of code 4 years ago. He looked at Walter with a version of the grin that had stopped working. "You know how it is. Family members always think they contributed more than they did." Walter tilted his head. "The module architecture in your engine matches Meridian's published design patterns at a structural level. Marcus's report identified naming conventions, dependency trees, and routing logic that are functionally identical." A pause. "Can you explain the load distribution algorithm in your core pipeline?" Trent blinked. The technical team, handles the specifics. I'm the CEO. I focus on strategy and the algorithm, Walter said, not unkindly, just precise. Is a weighted round robin with adaptive latency thresholds. Your documentation says it's proprietary. Can you describe how it works? Trent opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He looked at me, not with hatred, not yet, but with the panicked recognition of a man who has run out of runway and can see the trees. My mother stood up from her chair. Walter, this is a wedding. This isn't the time for Carol. My father, quietly, the first word he'd spoken in 20 minutes. She stopped. Walter looked at me again. Miss Hale, I'm going to ask you something directly. I met his eyes. Go ahead. Is the core engine of Lumora your original work? Yes. I said it the way I would answer a technical question in a code review. Clearly, specifically, without emotion. The core engine is based on a data routing prototype I built over 3 weeks, 4 years ago. The architecture follows a design spec I wrote myself. The commit history is entirely mine. I signed a consulting agreement with my brother, which he did not honor in full. No payment in full, no architect credit. The codebase was never formally assigned to the company. I built it on my own time, on my own equipment, outside the scope of my Northgate employment agreement, and the IP was never transferred. I wasn't performing. I wasn't dramatic, not tearful, not triumphant, not shaking with vindication. I was answering a direct question with documented facts. That was the only weapon I had ever needed. Trent's face went red. You're doing this here. At my wedding? You asked me to come. I came. You introduced me to your investor. He asked me a question. I answered it. You planned this. I didn't plan anything. I don't lie about my own work. Not for anyone. Trent turned to Walter. She's bitter. Look, this is a family issue. Whatever she thinks the IP was never assigned, Walter said, cutting him off with the gentle finality of a man who had spent 30 years reading contracts. If the core architecture isn't owned by the company, the investment can't proceed. This isn't personal. It's due diligence. My mother's face had gone the color of chalk. My father was looking at me, not with anger, but with something that might have been the first stage of understanding. The room felt smaller. The quartet had started again. Pachelbel of all things. The melody floating over the silence between us like a hand reaching across a table nobody was sitting at. What happened next didn't happen all at once. It happened in layers, the way a building settles before it fails. Cracks first, then creaks, then the slow, irreversible shifting of weight that was never distributed correctly. Walter stepped back from Trent, not physically, he was already standing apart, but his posture changed. Shoulders squared, hands clasped behind his back. The posture of a man who had made a decision and was now simply executing it. Trent, I want to be clear. His voice stayed low, measured, without heat. Our firm's investment in Lumora was contingent on clean IP ownership. The preliminary flag in Marcus's report was serious enough that I raised it with your team last Tuesday. Your CTO told me the architecture was developed in-house. That is demonstrably not the case. Trent shook his head violently. She's lying. She's doing this because she's jealous of everything I've stolen. She's not lying, Walter said. He didn't raise his voice. I've used her architecture. I've read her documentation. I know what her systems look like from the inside. Your engine is her work. That sentence landed on the room like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples went outward. Guests at the nearest tables had stopped talking. Brielle, who'd been dancing with a cousin, noticed the silence and started walking over. My mother stood frozen, one hand on the back of her chair, mouth slightly open. A woman watching the investment she'd made in her own story collapse in real time. My father stared at the floor. His hands were shaking. And Trent, who had charmed investors and reporters in boardrooms, Trent, who had built a career on the foundation I'd poured, and the narrative he'd constructed on top of it, was unraveling. He turned on me. His face had gone the color of raw brick. His voice climbing into a register I hadn't heard since. We were children and he'd broken something he couldn't blame on the dog. You did this on purpose. You came here to ruin this for me. I didn't respond. You couldn't stand it. You never could. You sit in your little cubicle building your little systems, and you can't handle that. I'm the one who actually made something of himself. Trent. Walter's voice was a flat wall. Trent spun toward the display table near the entrance. The one arranged with photos of him and Brielle. A guest book, a champagne tower, and the glass trophy. The Rising Founder Award. The one that had lived on my parents' mantle, transported to the venue like a sacred relic. He grabbed it. I don't think he meant to throw it. I think he meant to hold it up as proof. Proof that he was real. That what he'd built was real. That the engraving on the glass meant more than a commit log in a blue folder. But his hands were shaking, and the glass was heavier than rage, and it slipped. It hit the marble floor and shattered. The sound cut through the reception like a gunshot. Crystal fragments slid across the floor in every direction. Brielle stopped walking. She stood in the middle of the dance floor, her dress pulled around her feet, staring at the man she was supposed to have married that afternoon. And the look on her face wasn't anger. It was recalibration. The same expression I'd seen on Walter's face minutes before. Someone running the numbers again and arriving at a different total. Nobody moved. Pachelbel kept playing, and among the broken glass on the marble floor, the word founder was still readable on one of the larger fragments. My mother broke first. Not with tears. With strategy. She crossed the floor toward Walter, heels clicking on marble, a champagne-stained napkin still clutched in her left hand, and did what she had always done. She tried to renegotiate reality. Walter, please. This is a family matter. Vanessa has always had issues. She's jealous. She's competitive. She doesn't understand business, Mrs. Hale. Walter's voice was not unkind. Your daughter's architecture is licensed by my fund. Her published work is referenced in 3 industry white papers. The system she designed handles more daily transactions than any product in my current portfolio. A pause. I don't know what she is in your family, but in my industry, she's one of the most respected infrastructure architects in the Southeast. My mother's mouth opened, closed. She looked at me. Really looked at me, and for one fraction of a second, I saw something behind the performance. Fear, the pure, uncut terror of a woman who has spent 30 years constructing a story about who her children are, and has just heard a stranger dismantle it with facts she can't argue with. Then it was gone. Her face hardened. Then, well, if she's so successful, why didn't she ever say something? Why didn't she help her brother properly? There it was. Even now, even with the glass on the floor, and the investor pulling away, and the entire narrative in pieces around her feet, my mother found a way to make it my fault. I didn't argue. There was nothing to argue with. The blue folder existed. The commit log existed. The consulting agreement existed. I hadn't needed to bring any of it to the wedding, because the truth had done its own audit. Walter's team had asked the right questions. I had answered honestly. That was all. The money came up the way money always does in families that have staked everything on a single bet. Not in a boardroom, but in a hallway, between courses. In voices too loud for the setting, and too quiet for the magnitude of what had been lost. My father pulled me aside near the coat room. His tie was loosened. His eyes were wet. The retirement myrrh. We put in 140,000. Your mother and I, we believed him. I nodded. I know, is it gone? I don't know, Dad. That depends on what Lumora has left without the sterling round. He leaned against the wall. He looked old. Older than a man should look at his son's wedding. And for a moment I felt something I hadn't expected. Grief. Not for what Trent had done to me. For what my parents had done to themselves. My mother appeared at the end of the hallway. Walked toward us with the particular urgency of a woman who has just lost control of a situation and is looking for someone to contain. Vanessa, you need to fix this. I didn't break it, Mom. You didn't have to come here, and you told me to come. Trent told me to come. You added me back to the group chat so I could confirm my attendance at an event where my job was to stand still and be small. Her eyes flickered. Something beneath the armor, just for a heartbeat. I just wanted one thing to be proud of, she said. Her voice cracked. It was the most honest sentence she had ever spoken to me. Then she straightened her shoulders, blinked twice, and said, "You should have stayed quiet. You owed us that." The moment was gone. The wall was back up. I turned and walked toward the exit. Walter found me near the front entrance. I was standing under the portico, my car keys in my hand, the cool evening air pulling at the hem of my dress. The estate grounds were lit with landscape lighting that turned the trees into something out of a painting. Beautiful, staged, and entirely for someone else's benefit. "Miss Hale," I turned. He stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets. Behind him, through the glass doors, the reception continued. Diminished, confused, but continuing. Brielle was sitting with her mother. Trent was nowhere visible. "I want to be straightforward with you," he said. "The investment in Lumora is not proceeding. That decision was made before tonight, based on the technical review. What happened in there didn't change the outcome. It just accelerated the timeline." I nodded. "I also want to say I owe you an apology. Not for the due diligence that's process, but for not connecting the name on the report to the person in the room sooner. I should have reached out to you directly before tonight. You didn't know I was his sister." "No, but I should have made the connection." Marcus's report was thorough. The authorship was clear. A pause. "For what it's worth, your work speaks for itself. It always has. I didn't need Walter Sterling's validation. I had built Meridian without it. I had built a career without it. I had stood in that ballroom and answered his question without needing anyone's permission. But hearing a man who read balance sheets the way I read system logs acknowledge the architecture of what I had built, that wasn't nothing. "Thank you," I said. He nodded. I walked to my car. I came when I was told to. I was leaving because I chose to. Now I want to pause here for a second. If you've ever built something real, while the people closest to you called it nothing. If you've ever sat at the back table, while someone else took the bow for your work, this is exactly why this channel exists. Tell me in the comments, have you ever had a moment where the truth finally spoke for itself in a room that tried to keep you quiet? I read every comment, and if you haven't already, hit subscribe. It helps more than you know. The fallout arrived the way data arrives in packets, at intervals, each one adding resolution to a picture that was already clear to anyone paying attention. Sterling Capital formally withdrew from Lumora Series A within 72 hours. The stated reason was neutral, unresolved IP, but in the industry, neutral language is its own kind of verdict. To other investors who had been circling pulled back within a week. The regional tech publication that had profiled Trent as the quiet disruptor ran a follow-up significantly less flattering. Lumora didn't collapse overnight. These things rarely do. But the scaffolding was gone, and what remained was a company without clean ownership of its core technology, without its lead investor, and without the narrative that had been holding it together. The wedding was postponed. Brielle moved back into her parents' estate. I don't know whether she and Trent spoke after that night. That wasn't my business to track. In the family chat, the one I'd been removed from, added back to, and never once genuinely included in my parents, sent me a message for the first time that had nothing to do with Trent. My father wrote, "Are you doing all right, Mare?" My mother wrote nothing for 3 days. Then, "You could have told us." I replied once. I'm open to talking when the conversation starts with respect. Not before. Nobody responded. That was fine. I wasn't waiting for an answer. I was setting a boundary. The kind I should have set a decade earlier. The kind you can only set once you've stopped believing you deserve the silence people have been giving you. I went back to Northgate the following Monday. Meridian was still running. 400 million transactions a day. 9 states. 0 fanfare. Jenna brought me a coffee and didn't ask about the wedding. She just sat next to me at my desk and said, "You look like someone who finally exhaled." I laughed. First time I'd laughed in a week. The summit invitation was still sitting in my inbox. The one in Atlanta. The panel on scalable orchestration architecture. I accepted it that afternoon. Not because Walter Sterling's words had given me permission. Not because Trent's collapse had made me brave. Because I had spent 10 years building systems that held the weight of industries. And I had done it while my family called me a failure to my face. And I was finished letting their vocabulary define mine. The failure was never me. The failure was a family that measured worth by volume. By who talked the loudest. Who raised the most money. Who could fill a room with the sound of their own mythology. I had filled rooms with infrastructure. With reliability. With the kind of quiet, invisible work people only notice when it breaks. And mine never broke. Your worth was never something they had to brag about for it to be real. It was always doing its quiet work. Steady as a pulse. With or without their applause. That's my story. A blue folder I almost threw away. A room that told me to stay small. And a truth that stood up on its own the moment I finally stopped holding it down. If you've ever been the one nobody bragged about, let this be your sign. Stop shrinking. If this story meant something to you, please like this video, subscribe to her side of the story, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. For every woman who held it together alone, I'll see you in the next one.